My husband, 34M, hid a major secret for 10 years, and now my whole life feels like a lie. Hey Reddit, this is going to be a long one. I've never posted here before, but I'm at a point where I don't know what else to do, and I need some outside perspective. For context, I, 33F, have been married to my husband, Mark, 34M, for 10 years. We met when we were in college. He was this sweet, kind guy who always knew how to make me laugh. We got engaged after a year and a half of dating and got married right after graduation. I thought we had the perfect life together. But over the past few months, I've uncovered something that's made me question everything I thought I knew about him and about our marriage. It all started about 4 months ago. Mark and I live in a small town, and he works as an IT consultant. His job requires him to travel sometimes, but it's usually nothing too long, just a week or two here and there. For most of our marriage, we've fallen into a comfortable routine. I'm a high school teacher, so my schedule is pretty predictable. We don't have kids, though we've been trying for the past few years. It's been hard, but Mark's been my rock through all the fertility treatments and disappointments. Anyway, back to 4 months ago. Mark had to go on a work trip to a city about 4 hours away. It wasn't unusual, but this time he seemed different before he left, distracted, like he was carrying a lot on his mind. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just brushed it off, saying that he had a big presentation and that he'd been feeling stressed. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured he'd unwind after the trip, like he always did. But then, while he was away, something weird happened. Mark has always been pretty good about keeping in touch when he's traveling. He'll call before bed, text me updates, that sort of thing. But this time, I barely heard from him. The first 2 days, he only sent a couple of short texts saying that he was busy. Then, on the third night, he didn't call at all. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I stayed up late waiting to hear from him, but he never reached out. I told myself not to worry. It was probably just a long day at work, right? But something in my gut felt off. When he finally called the next morning, he seemed almost annoyed. He apologized for not calling but said he was swamped with work and that I didn't need to keep checking in on him. It felt like a slap in the face. I wasn't trying to check up on him, I just missed him. We argued about it, and I ended up feeling like I was being clingy. I told myself to give him space and that I was just overreacting. When he got back home, things seemed to go back to normal. But over the next few weeks, I noticed small things that started to bother me. He was more guarded with his phone than he used to be. He'd take it with him into the bathroom, which he never did before. And he'd get defensive if I asked him about work, like he didn't want to talk about it. I started feeling like there was this distance between us, this invisible wall that I couldn't understand. A few weeks later, my car needed some repairs, so I ended up using Mark's car for a day. While driving, I noticed that his glove compartment was a bit loose, so I tried to adjust it. That's when I found it, a small, unmarked box tucked into the corner of the glove compartment. Inside was a burner phone. My heart started racing. I knew it wasn't his work phone because I'd seen that one, and I had no idea why he'd have a second phone that he'd never mentioned. I tried to convince myself that it could be for work, that maybe he needed it for some security reason, but the unease wouldn't go away. After about an hour of arguing with myself, I turned on the phone. It wasn't locked, and there were only a few text messages on it. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The messages were from someone named Eva, and they were intimate. She talked about missing him, about how much she enjoyed their last time together. There were mentions of a hotel, a dinner they'd had, and a promise that they'd see each other again soon. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the messages. They dated back to about a month before that last work trip, but there was no context, just bits and pieces of what sounded like an ongoing affair. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I couldn't breathe. This was the man I'd trusted with my entire life, the man I thought I knew better than anyone. And here was this evidence of something dark and secret that I never could have imagined. I took photos of the messages with my phone and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Then I spent the next few days pretending that everything was fine, trying to hold it together while I figured out what to do. I kept going back and forth. Should I confront him right away? Should I wait and gather more information? Should I contact this Eva person? But I decided that I needed to know the whole story before I made any moves. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started snooping. I began checking Mark's laptop when he left it unattended. I even installed a tracking app on his phone, which made me feel sick with guilt. But I needed to know the truth. After about a week, I found out that he was planning another work trip. But this time, I knew where he was staying. When he left, I decided to follow him. I called in sick to work, packed an overnight bag, and drove the 4 hours to the city where he'd gone. I parked across the street from the hotel where he was supposed to be staying and waited. My heart was pounding the whole time. I felt like I was going to pass out from anxiety. I didn't know what I'd do if I saw him with her, but I couldn't stop myself. Sure enough, a couple of hours later, I saw him walk out of the hotel with a woman. She was tall, with long dark hair, and she was laughing as she linked arms with him. They walked down the street together, looking like any other couple out on a date. I stayed in my car, watching them disappear into a restaurant, feeling my world crumble around me. I couldn't confront him then, not without causing a scene. So I drove back home, replaying everything over and over in my mind. I spent the night crying, but by morning, I knew I had to talk to him about it. When he came home from his trip, I was waiting for him at the kitchen table, the photos of the texts and a picture of him with Eva on the table. He walked in, saw the evidence, and his face went white. I asked him, "How long has this been going on?" He just stood there, looking like a trapped animal. Finally, he sat down, buried his face in his hands, and started talking. But what he told me was something I never expected. He admitted to the affair, but then he said, "It's not what you think. Eva, she's my daughter." I just stared at him, not understanding what he meant. He explained that when he was in college, he had a relationship with a woman he'd never told me about, and that relationship had resulted in a child, Eva. He said he had no idea she existed until about a year ago, when the woman reached out to him, saying that Eva wanted to meet her biological father. He swore that nothing physical or romantic had ever happened between them. He said that he'd been keeping it a secret from me because he didn't know how to tell me that he had a daughter from a past relationship. He thought it would destroy me, so he decided to keep the meetings with Eva hidden. The texts, he claimed, were just the awkward fumblings of a father and daughter who barely knew each other, trying to find some kind of connection. I didn't know whether to believe him. My head was spinning. I demanded to see proof, birth certificates, messages from the mother, something that could prove that he wasn't just making up some wild story. He produced emails from Eva's mother, photos of a young girl that matched Eva's appearance, and finally, a paternity test confirming that he was, in fact, her biological father. It was like getting slapped in the face, but in a completely different way. If what he was saying was true, then he hadn't been cheating on me. But he'd kept a huge part of his life hidden from me for over a year. Longer, if you count the secret he'd been keeping about this past relationship. And he had a child, a teenager, who I'd never known about. He begged for my forgiveness, saying that he was overwhelmed and afraid, that he'd thought he could somehow build a relationship with Eva without destroying our marriage. But all I could feel was betrayal. It wasn't the affair I thought it was, but it was a massive deception all the same. He'd hidden his daughter, lied about his trips, and made me feel like I was losing my mind. I told him that I needed space, and I went to stay with my sister. It's been 3 weeks now, and I still don't know what to do. Mark keeps calling, saying that he wants to introduce me to Eva properly, that he wants to make things right, that he's sorry for how he handled everything. But every time I think about going back, I remember the look on his face when he came home that night and realized he'd been caught. I wonder if I'll ever be able to trust him again, even if he wasn't cheating in the way I thought he was. And then there's Eva. I feel so angry and hurt, but I keep reminding myself that she's a child who had no part in this mess. She didn't ask to be hidden away, to be part of her father's secret. But I don't know if I'm ready to meet her, or if I'll ever be ready. Hey everyone, it's been a couple of weeks since I last posted, and I wanted to give an update because so much has happened since then. First off, I want to thank everyone who commented on my original post. Some of you were blunt, others were more empathetic, but all of your perspectives have helped me try to make sense of the mess I'm in. It's been a whirlwind, and I'm still struggling to find my footing, but here's where things stand now. After my last post, I stayed with my sister for another week, barely able to sleep or eat. I was constantly replaying everything in my mind, the discovery of the burner phone, the texts, the moment I followed Mark and saw him with Eva. Every time I tried to make sense of it, it felt like I was peeling back new layers of betrayal. And then there was the guilt. Guilt over how I'd immediately assumed the worst of him. Guilt over how I felt towards Eva, a girl who had nothing to do with the choices her parents made. I knew she wasn't to blame, but I still couldn't shake the resentment bubbling inside me. Mark kept calling, leaving voicemails, sending messages saying how sorry he was and how much he wanted to fix things. He wanted us to sit down and have a real conversation about everything. I ignored him for days, trying to sort through my own feelings before I confronted him again. Eventually, though, I realized I couldn't avoid him forever. So I agreed to meet him, neutral territory, a quiet cafe that we used to visit back when things were simpler between us. When I arrived, Mark looked like he hadn't slept in days. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he seemed thinner, like he'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But I didn't feel much sympathy for him. He'd put us in this situation. I sat down, and before he could say anything, I told him, "I need you to tell me everything. No more secrets. No more half-truths. If I find out you've lied again, I'm gone for good." He nodded, took a deep breath, and started talking. He told me about the woman he'd dated in college, Laura, and how they'd split up just before he met me. He said he never knew she was pregnant back then. She'd moved to another state after they broke up and had cut off contact. Apparently, Laura only reached out a little over a year ago, saying that Eva had started asking questions about her father, and she thought it was time for them to meet. Mark had been shocked, but he agreed to meet with them. That's when he started sneaking off on those work trips. I asked him why he didn't tell me right away, why he would choose to keep this massive secret for an entire year, making me think he was having an affair. He looked down at his hands and said, "I was afraid, okay? I didn't know how you'd react. I thought you'd see it as a betrayal, that you'd think I was hiding something from our past." He said that he'd wanted to introduce me to Eva properly once he'd gotten to know her, but then he kept putting it off, afraid that the longer he waited, the worse it would seem. Hearing him say that just made me feel more frustrated. He didn't seem to understand that hiding something this huge from me for a year was far worse than any discomfort we might have faced if he'd told me the truth from the start. But there was more. Mark told me that Eva had been struggling. Her relationship with her mother was strained, and Laura thought that reconnecting with her father might help. Eva had apparently latched onto him quickly, seeing him as an escape from her tumultuous home life. He said he'd felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility toward her, and he hadn't wanted to burden me with it until he knew where things stood. The more he talked, the more I realized that Mark was desperate for some kind of redemption, not just from me but from Eva as well. It was like he was trying to rewrite history, to make up for the time he'd missed in her life. But all I could think about was how I felt like an outsider in my own marriage, like he'd been living a double life without me even realizing it. I told him that I needed more time, that I wasn't ready to make any decisions about our future. He nodded, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He asked if I'd be willing to meet Eva, and I said I'd think about it. Honestly, I didn't know if I could handle that yet. I didn't know if I wanted to. After that conversation, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it felt impossible. I couldn't focus at work, and I kept catching myself staring at my phone, wondering if Mark would call or text. Then, about a week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was Eva. She sounded nervous, but she was polite, saying that she hoped I didn't mind her calling. She said that her mom had given her my number, and she just wanted to reach out. I was caught off guard, but I didn't want to be rude, so I told her I appreciated her reaching out. We ended up talking for almost an hour, and she told me her side of things, how she'd grown up hearing stories about her mystery dad and how she'd always wondered what he was like. She said she never expected to meet him, but when she did, she felt like she'd found a missing piece of herself. She even told me that she'd been hoping to meet me, that she knew she was intruding into my life and didn't want to cause problems. It was hard not to feel some sympathy for her. She sounded so sincere, so vulnerable, and I could hear the pain in her voice when she talked about feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. But at the same time, I felt this cold, hard knot in my chest. It wasn't her fault, but she was the reason my life had been turned upside down. After we hung up, I cried for hours, not knowing if I was feeling sorry for her or for myself. Since that phone call, Mark has been trying to repair things between us. He keeps saying that he's willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. He's asked me to consider coming home, even suggesting that we try counseling together, and I've agreed to a few sessions, though I'm not sure if I'm ready to commit to anything long-term. I've also met Eva once, in person. It was awkward and tense. We met at a park, and Mark stayed in the background while Eva and I sat on a bench and talked. She was trying so hard to be friendly, like she wanted me to like her, but all I could feel was this overwhelming sense of grief for the life I thought I had. She told me about her plans to go to college, about how she liked painting and reading. She even apologized for being part of the chaos, though I told her it wasn't her fault. I tried to mean it, but I'm not sure I did. Now, I'm back at my sister's house, and I feel like I'm stuck in this limbo. I'm going to therapy on my own too, trying to work through the anger and betrayal. But every time I think I'm making progress, I'm reminded of how much has changed, how much has been taken from me. My sister thinks I should leave him, that I deserve better than someone who hid such a huge part of his life from me. But she's never been married, and she doesn't understand how much history Mark and I have together, how much I've invested in our life. How do you just walk away from a decade with someone? And then there's the question of whether I can ever trust Mark again. Even if he wasn't cheating, he was lying to me, keeping secrets, making me feel like a fool. Every time he went on one of those trips, I was at home worrying, feeling lonely, missing him. And all that time, he was building a relationship with his daughter without me knowing. I don't know if I can ever let go of that. But I also know that he's genuinely trying to make amends. He's been going to therapy on his own too, trying to figure out why he made the choices he did. He says that meeting Eva has changed his perspective on a lot of things, that he wants to be a better man, a better husband, a better father. And part of me wants to believe him. Part of me wants to try to rebuild, to see if we can salvage something from this mess. I don't know what the right answer is. I feel like I'm being pulled in a million different directions. My loyalty to the life Mark and I built together, my resentment over his lies, my guilt over how I feel toward Eva, and my own desire for some kind of closure. I don't even know if it's possible to forgive something like this. Can you ever really move past it? I'm supposed to meet with Mark and Eva again this weekend, and I'm dreading it. I keep wondering if I'm making the right choice by even trying, or if I'm just prolonging the inevitable. Part of me feels like I need to meet Eva again, to try to understand her, to see if there's a place for her in my life. But another part of me wonders if I'm just fooling myself, if trying to make this work is only going to cause me more pain in the long run. If you've made it through this update, thank you for listening. I'm still feeling lost, but I'm trying to take it one day at a time. Any advice or insight would mean the world to me, because I'm honestly just stumbling through the dark right now.